This is episode 376 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by former state rep Janice Arnold-Jones, and we're going to be talking about some voting bills going in the session as we currently sit here. The 30-day session is past its halfway point, and it'll be done before you know it, but there's plenty of mischief to be had in Santa Fe. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Janice.
Paul, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for being willing to talk about elections.
They are extremely important, obviously, and more controversial than ever, I think, not just here in New Mexico, but obviously at the national level. And of course, we'll be talking mostly here in this conversation about New Mexico and some proposed election laws. But before we get there, you are one of the first people when I began at the Rio Grande Foundation that I met. You're certainly the first elected official, I believe, that I encountered. You've been involved in New Mexico politics for some time. So for those who may not know who Janice Arnold-Jones is, why don't you tell them?
Well, my goodness. So I am a graduate of the old Albuquerque High School. Go Bulldogs. UNM, married to a Navy commander. We are from New Mexico. We came home. I was elected in 2002 and served until 2011, and then had a little stint on city council. Ran for Congress twice, did not win, and we can talk about that if you'd like, because the results have been not great. And in my spare time, I dig into issues, and elections and election policy happens to be one of them. I started this particular project. Actually, I started it in early 2020 because we started to train poll challengers once the consent decree was lifted. But on November 12th, 2020, I started looking at voter rolls in earnest.
All right. Well, let's talk about, first and foremost, your tenure in the legislature. You were known, and still to this day are known, as somebody who's a fierce advocate for open government and transparency. Not everybody might see that kind of connection there between elections and open government. How do you draw that line throughout your career?
You're exactly right. And there are things that are working better at the legislature because of some of those things. Pre-filing legislation, and I don't know, remember if you were on the floor when that happened. That was the first step. Webcasting is something else that we did. But elections are, it's an interesting line, but you as a citizen should be able to know what your registration looks like, and you should know without a doubt how people voted. And I don't mean that I need to know who you voted for, but I need to know as a group, did you go to the polls or did you not go to the polls? And it's not much more complicated than that. But the reason that people are so up in arms about elections is in the 2020 election, they got 4 or 5 absentee ballot applications. It was confusing. They can't get their dead relatives off the voter roll, so they keep getting mail. They know that they get mail at their house for people who lived there 20 years ago, and nothing changes. So they don't trust it. That is the worst thing that could happen to a representative republic. And I love going to the legislature because there are lots of people up there going, we have to fight for our democracy. Well, I'm fighting for a representative republic that is making reasoned decisions. And that's not happening at the Roundhouse right now. Mm-hmm. But I don't need to tell you that.
Well, there are a lot of directions we could go off of what you just said. I'll only add that I believe it was 2019, early in the year, when we were involved in the APS tax increase election. And that was my first, and I think many people, at least locally here, our first direct illustration of the inaccuracy of the voter rolls, because it was the first election under the new law where they sent the ballots out, and as you said, many people who thought that that daughter, that deceased uncle, that whatever, that should have been taken off the voting rolls were still getting ballots for that election. Now, before I let you go, I want to toot our horn because we were, to my knowledge, the only organization, the Rio Grande Foundation, actively engaged educating voters as to why that wasn't a good idea. And blessedly, the voters agreed with us and overwhelmingly turned it down. I can't speak to voter fraud that did or did not happen during that election, but it was something on the order of a 75% resounding loss for APS, victory for us. But the inaccuracy and the lack of kind of cleaning up of those voter rolls remains with me, and it's something that I consider a huge issue as we move forward because the problem, as you said, hasn't changed.
Right, it hasn't changed. And I thank you because had you not shined the spotlight on this issue, I would not have stood out in front of the pit to hand out flyers to people to make sure that they knew what the problem was. And my feet remembered that because it was darn cold, darn cold. But getting back to it was the APS bond election is what it was. And here's what I can tell you about that election. 440,000 ballots were sent out. 122,000 ballots were voted and returned. 56,000 ballots were returned marked undeliverable. And we have no idea what happened to the 220,000 that there's no record of. But here's what we learned afterwards, because you're right, that's really kind of the impetus of how I started looking at voter rolls. So we started cross-checking and trying to figure out, well, why did this happen? And of the 56,000 people, of the addresses in that batch of people, 92,000 voters received mail at that address. We know that. And yet 56,000 people had their ballots marked undeliverable. And many of those people actually lived there. The other side is there are 220,000 people, and we don't know where their ballots went. Did they go in the trash? I'm glad they weren't voted, but what is happening to them and the voter themselves have no idea. So here was this nugget of information, and I can't even begin to tell you why IPRA, that's Inspection of Public Records, that list of undeliverable ballots, because that really did start this work. And it's your fault, Paul. It's all your fault. And so here we are looking at some election bills, and I'm thinking, wow, I know that one of the bills sounds really good, but when I look at the real problems, it doesn't do anything. It isn't even a Band-Aid. It just is a feel-good, and that part's very discouraging.
Now, before we dive really headlong into some of the bills this session, let's kind of talk more broadly, pull the lens back nationally. Obviously, President Trump in the 2020 election called into question the integrity of a lot of the processes that are used. Then there's been a reaction to those opening policies, if you will, that liberalized the election law in a lot of states, not just blue ones, but red ones as well, in terms of expanding the way voting happens, and in red states predominantly pushing back against that. Now, Trump is certainly not the first person at the national level to call into question the integrity of the voting process. That's been done by Hillary Clinton herself, who's candidate in 2016 presidential election, and others all the way back to certainly the year 2000. When, if you're 21 years old listening to this podcast, ancient history here. There was a very contested election in 2000 between Bush and Gore. Involved the state of Florida, and eventually, for a variety of reasons, the U.S. Supreme Court determined that under the election laws of the states, that Bush was the legitimate winner. So anyway, with that kind of background here, talk about how the issues in New Mexico, because we have been a blue state throughout.
Sure.
So talk about where New Mexico lines up with and maybe deviates a little bit from this national conversation.
It's actually kind of difficult for me to say that we may be one of the best, But our current election laws, not the ones that are in the legislature, are actually pretty good in comparison. We do a number of things right, except that we are unable to clean the voter rolls. But that's another story. So,
Voter ID, that's not something we do here.
well, we do. It's just not where you think it is. Is it better than no ID? Absolutely. But over the years, as an example, if you want to register to vote, you must affirmatively present that documentation that proves that you are a citizen and a resident of New Mexico. But it doesn't happen right at the polls. So, Judge Hart, as an example, somebody walked in, somebody much younger, and claimed to be Judge Hart and voted for Judge Hart. And Judge Hart then walked into the polls and said, I'd like to vote. And they said, well, you've already voted. And that is exactly why you need not only challengers who can see the voter rolls, which they're not allowed to do currently, but that is exactly why you do need voter ID, because even on that off chance where somebody attempts to commit voter fraud, voter ID would stop 90% of it easily. And so I'm a voter ID person, but to say that we don't have any voter ID is not exactly correct.
That's fair.
But when I look at what's happening nationally, it is very clear 6 states were targeted, very clear. And we were not one of them. We can say we were.
6 states were targeted 2020.
2020.
Okay. Targeted in what way? And talk about those 6 states.
And those 6 states. So that includes Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. And they targeted their voter rolls, but their processes were not near as tight as our processes. And so they were actually able to go in and
Who's they?
Well, I'm not sure who they is at this moment.
Okay.
You can say it's hackers. You can say there was Russian interference. But what I know is the processes did not defend the voter. For example, in New Mexico, if you go to the polls, you must insert your ballot into the tabulator. Did you know that that's not true in all states? I didn't know that. I thought, well, of course, that only makes sense. In 3 of these states, you have to stick your ballot in a basket, and then they take them in the back, and some election worker sticks them in the tabulators. And it turned out that was a very weak link in the chain, and they stuffed the ballots. That's exactly what happened. And it's not to say that we don't have a rich history of stuffing ballot boxes, because we do. I mean, I have sat with folks in San Miguel County complaining that they got the call from the guy down at the clerk's office that they needed 400 more ballots, and they made the ballots as they were driving the ballot box to the clerk's office, and they got there and they really only needed 200, and they were mad they had to work so hard. But that is ancient history in New Mexico. Honest and truly, that just does not happen now. And I'm really glad of that. I feel kind of weird because I'm going to say we're still 50th in education in the nation. But along the way, partly because we were so bad, we were a little bit better than surprisingly, than we might have been. And part of that is driven by the fact that this state systematically denied Native Americans the right to vote by process. And so many of our laws actually had to be adjusted. For example, if you can't do it at a chapter house, you can't do it. If you do not have online access at all chapter houses, you cannot connect those tabulators. And that's probably the biggest issue in our state is, are the tabulators connected to the internet? Well, that is an open process. This time for Bernalillo County, I, along with some other people, went down and did a physical examination of, could the tabulators actually be connected? Was there some Wi-Fi card in there? There is a SIM card, but there's a one-to-one relationship. If you really want to work hard, could you have done something to the tabulators in Bernalillo County, all 660 of them? Yes, but it would be darn hard. So to that extent, you should feel pretty good about your processes, but we still have problems, and dirty voter rolls is by far our biggest vulnerability in the state of New Mexico. So let me just give you a highlight of starting with the 56,000 people whose ballots were returned. Here's what I know about Bernalillo County. There are 29,075 people who have never voted in over 6 cycles. So a cycle, this is part of the national voting laws, and that is every time you elect a congressperson. The national voting laws say that if you haven't voted in 2 cycles, you should be removed from the voter rolls. Do you think our Secretary of State does that?
I'll go with no.
That would be a correct answer. Correct. And that is the vulnerability, because if you have enough people who really aren't there, and you really do have people who are intent on compromising your voter rolls, where are you going to compromise it? Are they going to take your ballot and your information? Of course not. They're going to take people who aren't looking. That is the problem with our voter rolls.
Now, before we move on a little bit from that, you talked relatively favorably about New Mexico's current election law, and I'm not going to question you on that. But something that did come up in 2020 was the Dominion voting systems and the machines. How much of a problem do you think they are in general versus in New Mexico?
So, in general, the states that I named were all Dominion states, and they were all connected electronically. It was a huge vulnerability. In our state, I'm not saying that there aren't vulnerabilities with our voter roll as it is, because that is electronic when you go in to vote. But your ballot is inserted into a tabulator that does nothing more than count the ballots. That's all it does. These tabulators were purchased by Diana Duran in 2014. So you could argue it's relatively old technology. And again, I will tell you that in Bernalillo County, there are 660 tabulators. So to be able to actually corrupt all of them at one time is actually quite difficult. But some enterprising person will eventually figure that out. Whereas one of the issues in Arizona, and you would think all of our election laws are the same. They are not. Mm-hmm. In Arizona, did you know that their system actually makes a copy of your ballot? And so there's a duplicate, but it's hard to tell the duplicate from the original. And for the life of me, I don't know why that was in their election law. So there are little anomalies, but this is what protects our country. When H.R. 1, this was in Congress, was defeated for the 4th time, part of what H.R. 1 wants to do is to have the federal government run our elections so all of the vulnerabilities are absolutely the same. The thing that protects our elections, quite frankly, is the fact that we have 50 different systems. You may not like that, but that protects us. And I will fight tooth and nail to keep the federal government from taking our system.
Yeah, now we could dive in there. Maybe we will if we have a little time at the end. But certainly, while individual states have systems that you sometimes shake your head about the way they do things.
Yes.
And perhaps New Mexico at one time was one of those. But I'm glad to hear that, generally speaking, New Mexico's election law, as it currently stands, worth noting, is pretty okay.
But if we pass these 2 bills in the legislature, they are no longer going to be okay.
Right.
No longer.
And we'll definitely talk about those. But while the federalization of elections is certainly one aspect of those efforts that have been undertaken in Washington by Joe Biden and the Democrats in the Congress, that is the federal aspect is one of the least concerning. There's a lot of other aspects of that election law that they're really getting rid of voter ID. They're getting rid of a lot of accountability across the process, which would be very damaging. So
I would say, I just have to ask you a question, Paul. Is your privilege of voting one of your most sacred rights?
I believe it is in this country, yes.
So let me do some equivalencies here.
Okay.
Is your child's birthday something that you think is important?
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you go to the birthday party and get a present and all of that stuff?
Yes.
Because it's important.
Right.
Like your sacred privilege of voting, right? Okay. And if you go to somebody's funeral, do you call up and say, gee, I need 28 days to come to this funeral?
No.
No, because it's a discrete date, isn't it? And the one thing that I hate about H.R. 1 and also some of the legislation here and some of the rules in our state is it presumes that the voters in New Mexico, one, do not value this sacred right. They want to talk about it, but they don't value it. And you are too stupid to figure out when the election is. And so we have to open up the entire system to potential fraud so that it is extra convenient when you still may not go and vote. And what I know about our election system, now that we have moved from when I was elected, it was only 15 days. And oh, by the way, in the bills in our legislature, we're going to create a holiday that you get to pay for, in addition to 28 days of early voting. What I know is that the actual number of voters who are voting has not changed very much.
Right.
We have changed when you vote, but not that you vote. And it really doesn't matter. But the other side of this is the cost of your elections has septupled. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Sevenfold.
Yeah, there you go.
Well done.
And at some point you've got to go, wait a minute. What am I getting for my dollars? And is my vote any more secure? The answer is no.
And we can talk about early voting and some of the issues and benefits to that. But
did you say you wanted to jump into the weeds?
Well, we're going to jump into a different set of weeds, and I'm talking about. Let's go starting with SB 6, which is a election-related bill that, quite honestly, at the Rio Grande Foundation, we haven't followed as closely. It's derived fair amounts of bipartisan support. The big bill that the Democrats want, that Michelle Lujan Grisham has pushed harder, is SB 8. So I want to make sure there's a distinction there. This is the bipartisan election bill, SB 6. Now, talk about what's in that and some of the issues you might have with it.
Well, I would say, so SB 6 actually does some very good things, but it also does some Band-Aid stuff. So it
Band-Aid stuff?
Yeah. I mean, it looks pretty, but doesn't do anything.
Okay. Are there bad things in SB 6?
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. And one of the worst things in SB 6 is it changes the role of the challenger. Now, the challengers are actually set up as part of the NVRA, National Voter Rights Act. And it says, and assumes, I believe correctly, that in order to have secure elections, you need to have competing interests at the polls who should not be connected to the polls. SB 6 says that challengers will now be trained only by the clerks. And some of the clerks have said to me, well, shoot, we're already the fox, so you want a new fox watching the foxes? Is that what you want?
Wow. Okay, so let's take one step back and say that I don't know if it happens at every polling place, but at the polls, you, in a current situation in New Mexico, have poll challengers of both parties that if they see something fishy going on, they report it. And I'm not sure the exact mechanism. This is not something I've ever done, but is that basically the process?
Right. And because of that tension, and I do feel for the election workers. Nobody likes to have somebody looking over your shoulder, but that is the job of partisan challengers. Watchers are slightly different, but it's similar.
Right.
And it actually creates that tension where people are hyper vigilant. And that's a good thing. It is not an adversarial activity, but it is contentious. And if you walk in and you're in that orange jumpsuit, and I know that you actually just broke out of jail, and SB 8 has some issues in here that are going to make this scenario really interesting. But I know under current law that you should be in jail, that you are there because you are an axe murderer, and you tried to vote.
She found me out.
And the person at the desk, the system clerk, doesn't realize or doesn't look up and realize you should not be there. I, as a person who is a challenger, could say, I challenge this voter. And the PJ, the presiding judge, is going to hopefully stop what they're doing and say, okay, everything stops. Why are you challenging this person? I said, this person broke out of jail. He is a felon axe murderer. And they should go, oops, oh my goodness. Anyway, and that's what's supposed to happen. Now, there are times that kind of the reverse could happen. Is I could challenge you, and you're wearing a really horrible orange jumpsuit that your father-in-law loaned you because, and it was a mistake. And the other challenger would say, well, wait a minute. I know this guy, and yes, it's a horrible orange jumpsuit, but he's not a felon. At that point, your election board takes all the evidence into consideration. They make a decision, and hanging in the balance is whether or not you get to vote, or if they're unable to resolve that, then you as a voter would get a provisional ballot, and further research could be done. It's actually not a bad process, but that's how it works.
Okay, so we're going to need to move a little more quickly
faster
on some of these bills, but I just want to clarify, just so as of this recording here on Tuesday, February the 8th, SB 6 has passed through the Senate. It was sponsored by Senator Ivy Soto, Representative Georgine Lewis, those are Democrats, Senator Crystal Diamond, Representative Nybert, and Representative Lane. So those three are Republicans. It passed the Senate 39-0, so that means bipartisan heavily. What are some of the other big issues, though, with SB 6 as you see them, before we go on to the much more contentious SB 8?
Well, I'm going to say, so let me tell you the good things of the bill. The good things is that there is a procedure to identify voters who might not be there. There's just no procedure to do anything about it. It does do one of my favorite things.
To ID voters who might not be there. Can you?
Well, that's like the people who have been registered for 20 years here, haven't voted in the last 8 elections, and the truth is they're not here.
Okay, so they're not
here.
They physically may be in a different state. They may no longer be on this earth.
Right.
Whatever. Okay.
Okay, so that's one of the things. One of my favorite parts of SB 6 is that it prohibits third-party organizations from mailing multiple absentee ballot applications.
Okay.
And this is all going to be wiped out when SB 8 passes, and we do automatic absentee ballot lists.
So you're talking about a bill that SB 6 could pass and then be countermanded immediately by a separate bill.
Yes.
That could pass.
Yes.
Interesting.
And there are things, in fact, Senator Ivy Soto was explaining yesterday as SB 8 was getting out of committee that, in fact, the areas in conflict between these two bills, SB 6 has an emergency clause. And if and when SB 8 passes, the sections that are in conflict, SB 8 will supersede because it has a later effective date. And so those sections that might be good could well be wiped out.
Okay, so any other issues or positives with 6?
Well, I'm saying so. Those are some of the positives. They require that the ballot boxes be opened in front of the election board, which is the PJ and 2 election judges. Those are all really good things. They also require that the voting machine certification process be public, but it's already public. Here is the biggest issue I have with SB 6. The law already says challengers are entitled to see the voter registration roll. That's the one that says, here's Paul Gessing, and his birth date tells me that he is not 90 years old. I should be able to see that to be able to validate that. Maggie Toulouse Oliver, of her own accord, has prevented challengers from seeing that. But this bill says, in fact, we are going to say that challengers must reasonably be able to see and hear what's going on, which is a narrowing of the definition that we already have.
Okay.
That will make challengers actually, why bother? So now the clerks are going to train them. So any idea of independence has gone away.
Got it. Well, sounds like SB 6 has some pluses and minuses there. And
I was saying, don't you know it? It's really tough as a legislator to decide, do I take the half of it that's good, knowing that there's half that is not good?
well, before we dive into SB 8, we can, I guess, look at the bill that was signed by then Governor Susana Martinez, which changed the calendar for voting. An important bill nonetheless, because it consolidated school board elections and local elections. And right now, currently as we speak, there's local elections going on in, I know, Rio Rancho, Roswell as well.
You're
both
talking
have
about
elections.
HB 407 in 2018. Not
Sure.
to be specific.
Yes. See, I just remember there was this voting bill that passed when Susana Martinez was there.
And that's all good. We fought for years to move the school board elections, and finally that wisdom has paid off. And as you saw at APS, we actually almost have a non-union board, but a citizen board.
Yeah. And that, I would say, is directly in many ways attributable to that election law change. But one of the pounds of flesh, so to speak, that the Democrats got out of that was that when a local government adhered to that state law, voter ID goes away, the kind of voter ID I'm talking about, which used to happen, believe it or not, here in the city of Albuquerque, where you showed up to a Albuquerque city election and had to show ID, which I know blows people's minds because you're thinking, how did liberal Albuquerque have voter ID? Well,
Oh, it was Sally Maillet.
go.
City Councilor Sally Maillet got that done. And that is the extra double check that secures your vote. And I had to go to the Capitol and show that I took a vaccination. That was not good enough. I had to show an ID to show that the vaccination card that I have was mine. And yet our most sacred privilege in our democracy is our voting rights, and it's not worthy of that double check. Give me a break.
all right. You now sound like John Stossel now.
Sorry.
That's okay. Nothing wrong. I love John Stossel. We had him out twice. So SB 8, that is the one that's kind of the elephant in the room. It's
Yes.
the most problematic. And just as a initial starting point, we've followed this bill closely. It has now gone through 3 what I would call full iterations and is still being altered through the amendment process. Fortunately, for those of us who care about the voting integrity and all these sorts of things, that means that it's slowed down somewhat. But I've found, if nothing, in my experience in the legislature in Santa Fe, that if the party in power, i.e. the Democrats, wants something bad enough, they will, by hook or by crook, through the process, get what they want to get done. And we shall see, because SB 8 has been changed. And if you could talk about some of the initial just mind-blowing, crazy stuff, and then where we are now.
Sure. So when this bill first came out, the first salvo was that they wanted 16-year-olds to vote. They wanted felons to have their rights restored the moment they stepped out of prison. No parole, nothing like that. They wanted automatic voter registration. This is by far the most problematic piece, and they enshrined ballot drop boxes. Those were some of the big issues.
Well, let me jump in, because when we were following that bill, I would actually disagree mildly. I would say that the issue where they are collecting mail-in ballots through the Friday after the election
Right.
was
horrible.
yeah, that's probably the single best way to destroy credibility because
Yes.
nowadays you sit there on Tuesday of an election and you may not find final results out, especially in a big controversial presidential election, but here in New Mexico, at least when you wake up on Wednesday morning, they usually have the results.
Right, but did that sound like San Miguel County again? The original draft of the bill said that they would count ballots that came in after the close of the election for through the Friday after the election. Can you say ballot box stuffing? Come on.
And then straight ticket voting was also a part of that bill. And there may have been something else, but we'll have to move on because let's just say that the original SB 8 was atrocious, and then it was amended, or there were committee substitutes. So where are we now?
So the top note is 16-year-olds will not get to vote,
but 17-year-olds.
But 17-year-olds will get to vote provided they're 18 by the next general election.
Okay.
There is a constitutional issue with that, a big one.
Okay.
Because the Constitution defines adults and voters differently than what this bill says.
Right, and that is, by the way, local elections as well, not just any.
No, the local elections have been removed from this.
Oh, okay. So
this is anyone.
Presidential?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, because they couldn't figure out how to do this. And so it would be 17-year-olds would get to vote in any election as long as they turned 18 by the general election.
Okay.
And so no local elections. There is a good piece in SB 8 for which
Really?
There is.
Wow. It must have made it by accident.
One only. And that would be allowing nominating petitions to be filled out and completed electronically, so there would be a one-to-one check. In the city of Albuquerque, in our city races, we already do this. This was actually something that I pioneered many years ago. Was very rudimentary, and now we know that we can do it. Closest thing we have to signature verification, except that do they want to use that process when we are checking absentee ballots? They absolutely do not. Second thing, what still remains is a voluntary permanent absentee ballot roll. And this is my big beef.
Yeah, that is probably the worst provision of the bill as it currently stands.
Well, it's actually the second worst.
Okay, well.
I would say the first worst is automatic voter registration.
Okay.
To the extent that you may not know that you have been registered. If you happen to be a Jehovah's Witness, it is actually against your faith to do this. Okay. And we already know that there was a group of Jehovah's Witnesses in Sandoval County who were registered without their knowledge. They were horrified. It is your right to not be a registered voter. But the difference is this bill depends on the mail to notify you. And what we know, going back to the APS election, that you have a 1 in 3 chance of never getting your mail. And in order to decline this automatic voter registration, you must affirmatively send in a card that you may not get. And if you don't get the card, then you are on the voter rolls forever. There you go.
That's through MVD as well as Human Services Department and most other state agencies.
Right, including the clerk's office. But absolutely. So, pick your poison. But what our state has demonstrated clearly is maintaining lists. That's what a voter roll is beyond their capability.
Right. And it would be one thing to have this kind of registration going on where you had protections on the back end to say, if you are not voting, if you're there's some issue, that gets pulled back. But okay, so
let's talk about felons voting.
All right, so let's talk about that.
So that is still in the bill, and it's come back. So the original bill said felons would get to vote, and so if they are as soon as they walk out of prison, they get to vote. Well, it has changed a little bit, but it's really not that much better. So if you are out of prison, you may present yourself in person to a state agency or a clerk's office, and you'll get your voting rights back. So there's nothing that says tomorrow you won't be in prison again. They've spent a lot of time tweaking the words. So we are now talking about imprisoned inmates. It's a very interesting term. And the pardon, which is probably a good thing. If you are pardoned by a governor of a felony, there is now language back in it again for the third time that you would have your rights restored.
Now, something else that caught my eye, and there's, those are the biggest points of the bill as currently written. But one that I think kind of highlights the problem with the entire operation they're trying to pull in SB 8 is that it removes the statement regarding perjury from the vote by mail envelopes.
Absolutely. And can I fuss for just a second? It just drives me crazy that we are so very concerned about PPI. PPI is personal private information. And so in a previous bill, because of COVID, the last four of your social was now on the outer envelope under the privacy flap. Which is where the perjury statement was. Well, one of the things that has happened because of PPI, which is the private personal information, the poll challengers are no longer allowed to observe the absentee ballot processing because of PPI. Do you need PPI? There is another option. You could have used a year of birth. Now, there are some other processes that SB 6 actually tightens up, but it doesn't change the fact that you just nailed it. Anybody can sign that. There, in fact, in SB 8, if you go to state agencies and a state agency actually registers an illegal alien, there are two places where there are get out of jail free cards, where everybody is absolved of having registered somebody who shouldn't have been registered, not only the voter, but the person doing the registering. And it's in two different places in SB 8.
Yeah, it's just an interesting...
Do you like all these details?
Thank you for the details. But to
You're
me,
welcome.
anytime you're taking off it's the old cartoons with the little angel and the little devil, and seeing that statement, to me, when you're dealing with a ballot, it kind of reminds you, this is serious stuff. This is just if you have some inkling that you're going to commit fraud, don't forget there's perjury out there. Now, the fact that you're ever going to get caught and all these things that you and I may know, but the average person may not be aware of. And it's just kind of like that angel getting the last word in before the cartoon character makes his decision.
But you make a really excellent point. So committing voter fraud is a fourth-degree felony. Committing perjury was also a fourth-degree felony. We have just removed that penalty. Removed it because there is no perjury statement. It's removed. So you're going to hope that if somebody is committing voter fraud, and I know you're going to be shocked to hear this, but every year we actually convict a couple of people of voter fraud in our state. You never hear about
Amazing.
it. But it's true. And so, again, we've taken away the safeguard for our election. Do you ever wonder why people don't trust our system anymore? It is really sad. And that act alone is going to make people very uncomfortable.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to conclude this with a bit of a personal statement. So I was on the hearing for SB 8 in the first committee, and it was astonishing. I mean, first and foremost, like a 9-hour hearing, which was crazy. But the chair of the Rules Committee wanted to hear everybody and pledged to do that. And to his credit, they did that.
Yep.
But the heated rhetoric, especially from the left side of the spectrum, about Jim Crow and how not passing this was some kind of racist endeavor, that the fact that you don't think 16 and 17-year-olds should be voting is a reflection that you hate young people, or the whole Jim Crow thing is just bizarre, because nothing in this bill is oriented towards specifically improving voter outcomes for one racial or ethnic group or another. It's very much opening the system in ways that you and I think might cause some fraud and abuse, but it really doesn't have anything to do with getting more participation from African Americans or Hispanics or Native Americans.
Well,
even.
but the rhetoric is that if you don't allow, this bill started out with 35 days of early voting. I don't know about you, but I think it would be a blessing if we had 10 days. And
Sure.
then you can have your election day holiday that you do get to pay for, and that all the ads stop. I would be thrilled. Yeah. But right now, as a candidate in the campaign, you have to assume that the elections day is 35 days out. The cost is astronomical.
Yeah.
I was so glad that you were there. You were quite eloquent. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks.
But there was something else that happened at this meeting, and I want to thank you for your efforts. This is the first meeting that I can remember that Joe and Jane Citizen showed up, more than paid lobbyists and representatives from nonprofits who have an agenda that is really to turn our country into a Marxist state.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your time, and I just one last thing I need to add that the idea that voting is so important, but separation of powers over COVID policy, which the legislature for the last few sessions has completely abdicated to the governor. What are we electing these people to do if it's not to make policies important to a very big crisis, i.e. COVID-19? It strikes me as bizarre. But anyway, thank you, Janice Arnold-Jones. I do appreciate all of your information, and I think you really shared some great highlights on this piece of this effort and this issue. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube and Rumble channels. Subscribe to this show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.